Hello and welcome back to Life on the Wrist. Hope you're doing well. Today we're going to be looking at a Girard Perregaux reference 6211 in stainless steel from the early 1950s. Steel is a metal used in watchmaking that has a lot of connotations with it. Typically one thing about steel is that the mind goes directly to the robust nature of the metal. This metal was heavily used in producing watches that were considered tool watches. The Rolex Submariner or Omega Speedmaster being good examples of this sort of method and approach to watchmaking. But the metal was also used in other references that were not exclusively described as sports watches. As an example, you can find many vintage Patek Philippe references that had steel watches produced, for example, a steel 1518. Of course, those were manufactured in much lower quantities. Sports watches also did not have to be large in the past. Behemoths on the wrist that we sometimes see manufactured on the market today, or let's say in the last 20 years, was not a very common thing to see. Looking back in history, oftentimes these watches were actually smaller but mixed together a robustness and legibility that still maintained the tool watch functionality. Girard Perregaux throughout their history have created significantly important watches. Their part in watchmaking history is noticeable, especially given collectors who find these references so interesting. The reference 6211 is quite a good example of what the brand was capable of manufacturing. And that's the watch that you see in front of you today. So let's start with the basics. The reference 6211 appears to be a reference that was first introduced in the 1950s. The reference is a three-hand watch with hours, minutes, and center seconds complications. The version we have today is a great example of what is likely a very early version of the 6211. The watch has a stainless steel case that's in very good condition, with very few signs of wear and polishing. The signs of wear are really on the case back, but if you look at the sides of the watch and onto it, it really is in phenomenal condition. Looking at the case, as I mentioned, it's extremely sharp and it maintains what appears to be many of the original edges, especially if you look at sort of the lugs and where the lugs integrate with the case. The lugs, as you can see, are quite long and angle towards the wrist. If you look at the crown is unsigned, and then we come to the dial. The watch has a really beautiful white dial that is aged very evenly and is turned into sort of this creamy, warm tone. The watch has applied hour markers, as you can see, with numbers at 3, 6, 9, and 12 o'clock, giving it a very Rolex Explorer-esque feel. Now, we deducted that this watch was likely an early example of the reference 6211, and this is based on a few details. Firstly, the watch runs on the caliber 47 BF automatic movement. We'll get into the details of this movement soon, but this caliber was based on the ETA caliber 1256 and was launched in 1950 and used until 1954. And so this places this specific Girard Perregaux at the early stages of the 1950s. Secondly, the reference 6211 appears to come in two versions, one with an automatic signature below the Girard Perregaux name on the dial, which you can see on this specific version, and the other with a gyromatic printed below the name on the dial. So it seems that this reference sort of straddled a non-gyromatic and gyromatic models for this specific reference, And you can find other versions of the 6211 with both the automatic dial as well as the gyromatic dials. Being that the gyromatic models became a staple of the brand, this version definitely came earlier than 1957 when the first gyromatic was launched. So this really does place this specific piece in the early 1950s and likely the early version of the reference 6211. Aesthetically, this watch is extremely attractive. The steel case slopes effortlessly towards the wrist and really makes it sit very comfortably at 32 millimeters. The case appears so strong and sharp that it stands out significantly on the wrist, as I mentioned. The angles on these lugs are and the edges of the lugs are really strong. Additionally, looking at the dial, and I want to make sure I get a nice focus here for you. If you look at the dial, and specifically onto the hands, they have such a unique characteristic about them. They're in the form of a sword, but are like a long stretched out diamond if you look at the hours and minutes. The second hand also has a very similar shape at the tip of the hand, with luminescent material on the inside of the tip, which has actually fallen out, giving it actually what I think is quite an attractive look overall. The dial color is also extremely attractive, kind of like a lightly toasted piece of bread. If we move on to the movement and sort of some of the finer details you can find on this watch, there are no markings on the outside of this case back, but when you remove it, you'll obviously see that it's a water-resistant screw-down case back. But when you remove it, you can see the Girard Perregaux logo inscribed on the inside of the case back. Also, one will see the case metal printed, which is stainless steel, as well as the reference number, which is 6211. If you look at the movement, which I alluded to before, one will see the caliber 47 BF inside of the watch. As previously mentioned, this movement was introduced in 1950 and made through until 1954. It's based on the ETA caliber 1256 movement and is a 11.5 line, 27 joule movement with 40 hours of power reserve, oscillating at 18,000 VPH. It also has ankle block shock protection, and that obviously is really important for watches during this era, as sort of technology is advanced. If you look under the balance wheel of this watch, one will actually see the number 1256 indicating its base caliber. As I mentioned, on the wrist, it fits really nicely. The watch is 32 millimeters in diameter, and so it's going to fit, a little bit smaller, but the lugs are quite long. They do extend out towards the edges of the wrist quite nicely, but they still do angle towards, down towards the wrist, making it sit very comfortably on the wrist. I think overall it was a very attractive stainless steel piece with sort of that vintage Rolex Explorer flair. Cleanly aged dials, sharp cases, and attractive looks are all characteristics watch collectors love. This Girard Perregaux has all those components in spades. Another great example of how good Girard Perregaux was at making watches that are easy to love. Hope you enjoyed taking a look at this really beautiful reference 6211 from Girard Perregaux. This watch, it was a really fun piece to sort of research because, as I mentioned, the 6211 was a gyromatic model from Girard Perregaux, and so the anomaly of the automatic written underneath the Girard Perregaux name was quite an interesting thing to research. But there are other examples of this reference out there that have this automatic signature, and so placing it as a sort of an earlier version of the 6211 was quite interesting. It also was interesting to me that the Girard Perregaux as a manufacturer wasn't going to use a different reference number as they moved from having the automatic signature on the dial over to the gyromatic signature on the dial. So I thought that was quite an interesting bit of research, and I think it shows the significance of really understanding histories of movements, because that can really help you place specific models And just another example of why researching watches are really great. And then if you have it on this really beautiful light brown sort of tan strap, I think it really makes the creamy dial pop really nicely. So this was a really fun piece to research. I hope you enjoyed sort of learning a little bit about it, learning about the reference, and being able to see the watch in the metal. As always, there will be an article on lifenerds.com about this specific piece where we dive into the history of the piece, the movement, etc. You'll also be able to see pictures of the inside case back as well as the movement and some additional shots of the watch if you want to see those. I encourage you to go to the show notes, the description of this video, and you'll get a link to the article. If you are new to Life on the Wrist, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and my question for today is, do you enjoy collecting vintage Girard Perregaux? I'd love to know your thoughts. My second question for today is 32mm too small? I think that's probably what will be the off-putting piece for collectors, is the fact that this is a 32mm diameter piece. But to me, I think you can enjoy pieces no matter the size of the case. If you are, so let me know in the comment section below about that. If you wouldn't mind liking this video, it really does help me out. With that said, guys, thank you so much for watching this video, and until next time.